Hello and most welcome to Heidegger 1267 or 1267 if you prefer. And as you can see, we've got some snow here. There's been a considerable change in temperature. This is proper winter. Glistening snow everywhere, and it will continue for some time onwards now. Quite beautiful. It's melting in the snow. Doesn't look bad at all. And I will make more of a commentary lecture today, and it's called the inner and outer global thinking, the cognitive aspect of the cosmological fallacy. It has enormous implications on all strands of knowing, and is in cognitive science and psychology called global thinking, which is the equivalence of the cosmological fallacy. Very short and incorrect. Global thinking is thinking about oneself, one's thinking, emotional life, desires on the wrong level. Not the level of oneself, but on the level of generality or universality. It is almost a bit like das Man, but there are some significant differences. I am absolutely convinced that global thinking is coming from the cosmological fallacy, and that it was impossible before the advent of Newton. It's global thinking is cause of enormous suffering in people. It is giving oneself advice that don't fit the level or don't fit within oneself. They become the T2 N2 complex, that is obligation, force, and I would say more specific, not adequate, not in the right position. And this is actually coming from the cosmological fallacy. There is an important point. Roberto Unger was more contacted by Smolin than the opposite. And the ideas that are posed in the singular universe are more coming from Unger than Smolin, and this contact has changed Smolin's conception. It is incredibly interesting because, remember, Unger is an economist, politician, philosopher of state, philosopher if you want, but he's an incredible thinker above all. I will also show how this cosmological fallacies has ventured into politics since long ago with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And specters of Marx from Derrida now gets even more thrust without a doubt. It is obvious that Marx is coming from the cosmological fallacy. And this is also the lure of Marxism, communism, socialism. It takes a global perspective on things. It's a little bit, why did not the 5-year plans succeed? And people often say they were good in theory but not in practice. To this, Unger and Smolin say, no, the problem lies within theory. The problem is global thinking or the cosmological fallacy, well established by the time of Karl Marx. So continue. I'll first end, because I was cut a bit short, and I was reading from a single universe. I'll repeat the whole last paragraph. I think that is probably the safest to go about. Cosmic time must, instead, be interpreted from the perspective of a relational view. The hallmark of such a view is that time be understood in terms of both relative change and causal connection. In such an understanding, the ultimate grounds of the causal unity of both the universe and its history are the variability, discontinuity, or irregularity of change within this nevertheless unified and historical universe. Time on this view is global because the singular universe has a single history. Global time is perceptible and in principle measurable because change is not uniform. Over the universe and its history, and because how change happens is itself subject to change. In the ontological program informing Newton's physics, the real is equated with the absolute. It is real by virtue of standing outside the chaos of change and motion. This chaos amounts to an illusion, hiding the reality of nature. We, on the contrary, argue in this book that phenomena are real precisely to the extent that they belong to the network of evolving relationships. Constitutive of the world. It is not an external reference that defines change. It is the dynamical network of relationships. Real time is the reality of such changes. The temptation to misinterpret the thesis of global time from an absolute rather than a relational perspective is aggravated by a strange and striking feature of the history of these ideas. The absence of any adequate statement of the relational view. This absence puts a heavy burden on those of us who would invoke a relational conception. The trouble with Leibniz's version of the relational approach is that it forms part of a philosophy that hollows out the meaning of causation. Listen to this. It hollows out the meaning of causation. That is a grave accusation. Think of your own lives, your own thinking. If you have unreality of time, that would affect every thought you have about what you were going to do. Whatever you were planning, all your observation, all comes out of time. And well established in the academic intellectual thinking is the Newtonian concept of no time. You can just imagine the immense, disastrous moment. It's a randomization of thinking. This is without no doubt in my mind the closing of the Western mind. There is no clear, directed, sharp thinking if the underlying stratum is the Newtonian paradigm. I'll read it again so it really enters your thinking. The temptation to misinterpret the thesis of global time from an absolute rather than a relational perspective is aggravated by a strange and striking feature of the history of these ideas: the absence of any adequate statement of the relational view. This absence puts a heavy burden on those of us who would invoke a relational conception. There are two comprehensive statements of the relational vision in the history of natural philosophy. That of Leibniz and that of Mach. Neither of them serves the purpose. The trouble with Leibniz's version of the relational approach is that it forms part of a philosophy that hollows out the meaning of causation, and thus as well of time. it does so not just by the metaphysical machinery of his monadology, but also more generally by the reduction of causation to logic or mathematics. An impulse prophetic of the direction that physics would take. The flaw in Mach's variant of the relational position is that it confusingly combines a relational perspective with a very traditional, indeed Newtonian, view of causation. The relational idea comes into its own only when we revise our ideas about causality and about the relation of causal connections to laws of nature. It is only when we understand causation as more general and more basic than the laws of nature, and therefore as an antecedent rather than a subsequent to laws of nature, and as a feature of the world rather than as a mere construction of the mind, that the radical character of the relational view becomes apparent. Mach's phenomenalism prevented him from moving toward any such conception, or indeed from giving a clear account of what Einstein came to dub Mach's principle. Three questions immediately arise with regard to the idea of global time and its meaning in the argument of this book. How does cosmic time under a relational view differ from cosmic time under an absolute Newtonian view? In a relational conception, how can the thesis of the global character of time be reconciled with the undisputed finding of variation in the passage of local time, or of the relativity of local times? If global time exists, how can it be measured? I give greater consideration to the second of these three questions. It leads itself to the vital task of disentangling science from metaphysics. What 20th century physics actually discovered, as distinguished from the meta-scientific lens through which the hard core of its empirical findings have been read. By cosmic or global time, I mean always a single, preferred, and universal time, rather than the infinite number of alternative space-time coordinates allowed by the most widely accepted interpretations of general relativity. The chief distinction between cosmic time under a relational and absolute view is that for a relational account, the global character of time resides in the unbroken and inclusive web of connections in the singular universe and in its singular history rather than in some independent place. The place of the invariant background or of the eyes of God. It may be objected that this statement simply alters the meaning of the words by calling change and causation time. However, something of great consequence is at stake. Nothing is for keeps in nature. No typology of being as described by particle physics and by the periodic table. No set of laws of nature, no ways by which some things change into others, only changing change endures. When we consider change from the standpoint of its variability, the way that some things remain unchanged while others are changing, or change in some ways while others change in other ways, we call it time. When the seat of this ceaseless transformation is the whole universe, viewed in the relation to its own history or to the local changes that go on with it, as more than the sum of its parts. We call it global time. The prime empirical referent of the concept of cosmic time is the discovery that the universe has a history against the background of the assumption that both the universe and its history are causally united. In invoking the concept of global time, we bet that this history can be told as more than an open-ended collection of local histories that remain incapable, even in principle, of being combined. Cosmology needs a conception of global time if it is to become a historical science. The denial of cosmic time and the view that this denial follows from the empirical discoveries of 20th century views contradicts the view that science can properly investigate only parts of space-time. Such a cosmological minimalism invites two responses. No one can deal with a part without making assumptions, albeit loose assumptions about the whole. The assumption that the history of the universe is just a pack of local history does not exempt us from this requirement. The universe we know since Lemaitre and Hubble had a beginning about 13.8 billion years ago. Our understanding of the local histories will be informed by assumptions about universal structure, about universal history, or about both. If cosmology is not to be a historical science, it must be a structural science, like chemistry. The problem now is that it is neither. The fundamental objection to turning cosmology into a structural science is that everything structural changes sooner or later. The relational revision of meaning of global time, suggested by the preceding considerations, goes a long way to answering a second question provoked by affirmation of the thesis of global time. How can variation in the local passage of time, according to the disposition of matter in the universe, abundantly confirmed by the empirical findings that we associate with special and general relativity, be reconciled with the existence of cosmic time? Under this view, no obstacle exists to such a reconciliation, so long as the idea of global time can be given observational significance and laid open once again in principle, if not yet in practice, to measurement, which is the third question. There I stopped the reading of Roberto, page 231. So I started to read this article how from a Marxist perspective, the idea of real time and real world is dangerous. And this is actually to do with the Nobel Prize. New Scientist magazine has been conveying complex scientific ideas to the general public in an accessible way for over 6 decades. Oh, how the mighty have fallen, alongside the indignity of its 2021 purchase by the Daily Mail General Trust, Britain's foremost producer of right-wing rags. This once proud publication has increasingly turned its back not only on quality science journalism, but reality itself. The dead end of capitalism is leading to the ruling class to promote mysticism and solipsism. This is having a corrosive effect on science and philosophy at all levels. Instead of educating readers about the latest inspiring breakthroughs in human knowledge, magazines like New Scientist are filling their pages with idealist drivel. Ironically, these notions are neither new nor scientific. In fact, the mostly parrot all ideas, such as those of the reactionary 18th century Bishop George Berkeley, an outspoken enemy of science, and particularly of his contemporary Sir Isaac Newton. We are not suggesting the majority of scientists share these views, but it is undeniable that New Scientists is giving a major platform to subjective idealism, as we can see with the example of the 3 featured articles published between 2020 and 2022, 2 of which made the front page. These reflect a subjectivist trend within the scientific establishment, which is being communicated through popular culture to the wider public for nefarious ends. In order for science to advance, it must take as its starting principle that there is a single objective reality out there, our understanding of which can be perfected through observation and experiment. Instead, a February 2020 New Scientist feature with the headline can we perceive reality, opens on a note of existential uncertainty. I don't know about you, but I feel I have a perfectly good perception of reality. Inside my head is a vivid depiction of the world around me, replete with sounds, smells, color, and objects. So it is rather unsettling to discover that this might all be a fabrication. Unsettling indeed. And what is the cause of the author's sudden lapse in confidence in their senses? They cite Donald Hoffman, a psychologist at the University of California, author of a modestly titled book, The Case Against Reality. Hoffman presents its so-called interface theory of perception, arguing that our sensory system condensed the complexity of the real world into a simplified user interface, filtering out superfluous information for the benefit of our comprehension. Now, it's certainly true that our brains are adept at recognizing patterns and unconsciously filtering out much in our sensory experience. For Professor Hoffman, however, the interface is all that exists. What we think of reality is nothing but an abstract data structure for something that doesn't even exist in space and time. And therefore, if you have this notion that reality is something that is inherently different from the mind, then it becomes paradoxical to think that we ever have access to reality. This paradox is identical to an argument proposed hundreds of years ago by Immanuel Kant, who, despite his many important contributions to science and philosophy, was an idealist and thus had his limitation. Kant reasoned that we can only know appearances of reality based on our sense perception and never the thing in itself. In exactly the same way as Professor Hoffman argues, the mind imposes a data structure. Kant argued the mind imposes a priori abstract thought categories to make sense of our sense data. But while these categories may help us order our thoughts, for Kant, the essence of reality itself is unknowable. However, as Friedrich Engels explains in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, practice, development, and the history of science are the ultimate proof of the objective world. He gives the example of the development in biology and chemistry, which have allowed scientists to reproduce natural phenomena, including the chemicals produced internally by plants and animals. These were thus transformed by the march of science and human knowledge from ungraspable things in themselves into things for us. To give him his due, Kant was a scientist and philosopher of stature, but by replicating his weakest side, Professor Hoffmann undoes centuries of progress at a stroke. The author then takes Hoffmann's arguments to their conclusion, asking whether people at least share the same misrepresentations. This seems like a reasonable assumption, the author suggests. After all, humans have roughly the same brains and sensory systems, and when we talk about our conscious experiences, we all seem to be on the same page. So it's a vehement and caustic attack from Marxists against these new ideas. This goes to show that our cosmological fallacy is the foundation of Marxism, unbeknownst to themselves, just like Kant based everything unbeknownst to himself on the Newtonian paradigm. And this goes into the very structures of our cells. I will read a little something from a very good author about the Alexander technique. Yes, we are jumping here for good reasons. His name is Daniel McGowan, and it's called Alexander Technique and the Spiritual Quest. And he writes in chapter 8, page 60, about sensory appreciation. And in Alexandrian terminology, if you are familiar with that, sensory appreciation means how to feel your body, the positions of the limbs, your internal organs, are you hungry, but also in an extended format, and possibly more important, your thinking processes, your desires, your wants, your emotions, and very important, your thinking responses. And we know today sensory appreciation has gone down, and that actually means that we don't feel our thinking anymore. They will be left out of our control or influence. And that not being able to reach into your own thinking is also called global thinking. It sounds like you're talking about yourself, but you're not. You can be interviewed about yourself, but the words you bring about are not stemming from your inside. This has been widely recognized since the 50s, and is becoming increasingly more common. It can be compared to advices in songs about how to live your life, or Hollywood movies that tell you, do this and be happy. They are there for our amusement. If you take them seriously, they will give you global thinking, because you are a unique individual with your personality that you need to know and learn about to find the clues and how to go forward with your life. Sensory appreciation. There is a problem, perhaps the greatest of all, certainly the most immediate, which humankind has to solve if permanent benefits for all, be they mental, physical, material, emotional, or spiritual, are to be realized. This problem is that of our faulty sensory appreciation. The most serious symptom of our inability to adjust to the accelerating demands of modern civilization. Psychophysical activity, our daily doing, is our response to stimuli received through the senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. The quality of perceptions and conceptions formed through this process, as well as the nature of reaction to these stimuli, is determined by the standard of psychophysical functioning of each individual at any given time. In other words, our abilities to apprehend with the mind perception and to form an idea in the mind, conception, are dependent upon the quality of our general psychophysical use and functioning. The dependence of these processes on our general psychophysical condition is of paramount importance, because all perceptions and conceptions are influenced by sensory processes. In every case, the nature of our reaction, whether it be an actual physical movement the dependence of these processes on our general psychophysical condition is of paramount importance, because all perceptions and conceptions are influenced by sensory processes. In every case, the nature of our reaction, whether it be an actual physical movement, an emotion, an opinion, or a belief, will be determined by the concerted activity in action and reaction of the processes of perception and other mechanisms which produce the feeling or thought emotion that we experience. This concerted activity can be termed sensory appreciation. Another equally important sense, which constitutes one of these other mechanisms and also functions concurrently with those already mentioned, is proprioception. This process applies to sensory nerves, which serves muscles, tendons, joints, and the middle ears. Information travels back and forth from these places to the brain and tells us not only about the interaction between one part of the body and another, but also of the body's interaction with the environment. This process is really our sixth sense. The universal incidence of misuse of the psychophysical mechanism in the modern world indicates all too clearly how badly this sense is ignored, neglected, and misunderstood. In an organism suffering from misuse, the general sensory appreciation, not just proprioception, is extremely faulty. Such a person's beliefs about how he uses his thoughts, mind, emotion, and body complex in everyday life are questionable. The relativity of subjective faculties and objective phenomena constitutes human experience in the waking state. A study of both the subjective and objective elements of relativity reveals that what we perceive has neither more nor less reality than our perception. The world of our everyday experience is not what it appears to be. The world is experienced through the senses, through our awareness of movement, through our states of consciousness, modes, Stimmung. These elements, therefore, of the psychophysical self constitute such essential factors in our world of experience that objects which stand outside the body cannot be separated from them. Senses and sensed objects are an indivisible unity. Again, things cannot stand alone in isolation. They must be perceived by some mind in considering the relativity of subjectivity and objectivity. We cannot assume that the so-called things which appear to be out there in space possesses any self-identical extensions at all independently of the relational factors in perception. One of the greatest development in modern time is the diminishment of our direction. The cosmological fallacy, I would say, is also the creation of the idea of a conscious mind, and that this conscious mind is infinitely small. It is as small as the structures given to us by Newton and Descartes. I read the following from the next page. This crucial moment when human being began to reason and analyze also signaled the start of the decline in our use of the physical body. At this point, our attention began to be deflected from it. We ignored it more and more as our abstract thinking increased to the amazing degree that we now enjoy in the present day. This mental growth has been achieved, however, at high cost, because the excellent use the body has enjoyed was sacrificed. The result of this can be seen throughout the modern world. Deterioration of the coordination of the body brought a simultaneous decline in our sensory appreciation. The latter is now so unsatisfactory that most of us are unaware of what we actually do with the mind in any multitudinous acts of our daily lives. Restoration of accurate sensory appreciation is, as already stated, the first step we have to take to obtain a more reliable means to knowledge. This is of the utmost importance. Learning coordinate use of the mind will restore our sensory appreciation to greater accuracy and reliability. This is similar to how David Bohm wrote about sensory appreciation or thought proprioception, global thinking, and the cosmological fallacies will block out proprioception of the thought. It will destroy or take away, I would say, the access to our inner workings, and thereby also ridding us from access to the world. And this is the Klein bottle once more. For instance, I can imagine most people have an idea that this chair that the student is sitting on to study has nothing to do with the study. Some mysterious reason Descartes has came here to cut the two things in part. The body is material, according to academia today, made of atoms and molecules, same matter as this. Therefore, we can ignore it. And be monstrously arrogant and, I would say, ignorant beyond the biblical sense of ignorance is that it won't affect what comes out. It's a horrible, horrible misunderstanding. It's like saying, what I put in to a stew to make dinner has no effect on the taste. You can put gravel in, you can put dirt, the tail of a rat. This chair is the tail of the rat. This very construction where I'm in defies humanity. But that's not the biggest problem. I would say the cosmological fallacy is the biggest problem. These are the mere symptoms. And if you're not suffering from the cosmological fallacies, I can assure you can be sitting on the floor or on the table like a tailor position. You can still survive. But it would be very hard for anyone to sit on this in a coordinated and well way. It's a horrid chair. They also look big and expensive. When we don't sense our bodies, we don't sense our thoughts. Remember from neurology that the N1s and the N2s are intimately connected. They are the Klein bottle, they are the same things. Therefore, how the body is positioned, how harmonious is your thinking. That is your thinking. Klein bottle shows that the product of what you do has as its defining limit always the current use of your body. The outcome will be less if you misuse your body. The degree of using the body is the same as the degree of what you produce. What exactly do I mean by unsatisfactory sensory appreciation? Simply put, a particular stimulus brings a reaction that registers in one's senses quite differently than what has actually happened. Ask a person to sit down, for example. In doing so, she will, among other things, stiffen and shorten the neck muscles. When this and other things are pointed out to her, she expresses surprise, even to the point of denying that she did so. General misuse and consequent malfunctioning of our psychophysical organism affects our ability to register sensations and experiences. We are now at a point collectively where our subconscious habitual behavior no longer meets our needs with regard to self-improvement of any kind. a closing of the Western mind, if you may. Despite thousands of years of apparently wise words from the philosophers, few have come up with real practical procedures that can be adopted and applied to daily living. Most have produced intangible theories with no practical value. Constructive awareness fills this gap. Without it, our fears and beliefs about things, both outside and inside ourselves, fail because due to defective sensory equipment, we are unable to put our theories into practice effectively. The individual is central to all experiences, and our defective psychophysical functioning and sensory awareness are what meant to prevent us from bridging the gap between theory and practice. A rational scientific attitude toward this problem is absolutely essential. As John Dewey says, any sound plan must prove its soundness in reference to concrete consequences and to general principles. Any theory or principle must be judged by its results in operation and must provide a method for making evident and observable what its consequences are, and guarantee that these consequences flow from the principle. When judged by this standard, constructive awareness, constructive re-education is scientific in the strictest sense. Life is too complex is the excuse of the modern human being. But we should not indulge in the pathetic fallacy of blaming life for our ailments. We should realize instead that while we are complex creatures, good use of the organism is a simple act. Adequate development of the individual, spiritual or otherwise, requires a better standard of coordination of the psychophysical mechanisms. An attempt to learn something, be it the rudiments of arithmetic or the mysteries of mentalism, is the natural response to wish to do so. A satisfactory result depends on satisfactory direction and control of the organism. The present day lack of this direction and control limits our ability to learn anything, because it manifests as mind wandering or not keeping our minds on the job. Well, we know from the cognitive sciences that about 80% of the population are suffering from memory loss, not the ability to have a memory. This is grave. When there is no memory, there can be no lucid thinking. You will not reach your thoughts where they are. And you will also have hidden thoughts that will rule you, decide your destiny. This is what Benjamin Libet proved, is that we are not in control of ourselves anymore. If we don't have access to our own thinking, hidden thoughts will rule our doings, and they will give you a signal that you imagine that you are conscious, but you're not. That is the reflective consciousness of Richard E. Lind. And that attenuated non-consciousness is responsible for global thinking, or an adherent of the cosmological fallacy. You're more than welcome to see a video where you can see, for instance, the scientist Max Tegmark sitting in a chair. He is literally a brain in a vat. There is no contact whatsoever with the outside world. That's mind wandering, not keeping our minds on the job. And that is also the reason the second cosmological fallacy, the idea of no time, is disastrous on thinking. Because time produces everything in the world. Everything is mothered by time. Without it, you will lose reality. Things develops in time. There is no time, you have no access to reality anymore. That is the hard lesson coming from quantum mechanics. Another speculative glance into the early, uncivilized stage of our evolution is now necessary. The subconscious behavior which guided the human being then, together with her excellent sensory appreciation and physical condition, were sufficient to meet her needs in the almost unchanging routine of her daily life. It is almost beyond the power of the modern person to comprehend that the experiences of millions of years, all the thousands of lifetimes, had gone into the building up of this so-called physical development. The experiences we have gained on the so-called mental side were infinitesimal in comparison. The adoption of physical exercise is an example of humankind's faulty sensory appreciation and erroneous conceptions, showing unbalanced judgment. They generally are based on the Hegelian principle of cure, which ignores the means principle as a preventive measure. Cures for this and that are not the answer to our problems. Right thinking is the world's great need. The unbalanced state which we now reached shows little evolutionary progress from that of Stone Age man. Indeed, in terms of violence, we have gone backwards. The incredible numbers of wars that have raged in the 20th century, together with the devilish sophistication of modern weaponry, confirms all too clearly that we are capable of hideous brutality that outstrips the evil of our prehistoric ancestor. This reliance on blind, subconscious behavior is not only evident in our choice of physical exercises as a universal cure, it also characterizes our uncoordinated attempts to execute them. Due to faulty sensory appreciation, this blindness has resulted in the modern person being the most imperfectly coordinated creature in the history of humankind. We see our deterioration as a muscular one only, not as a general psychophysical one. We have overlooked the fact that all our attempts to remedy our defects have failed because their effectiveness has been measured by imperfect and delusive sensory appreciation, itself caused by the decline in our coordinated use of the psychophysical self. The remedy idea has been geared to gaining an end, the means being totally unrecognized. In adopting physical exercises, we not only fail to recognize that most of them are mechanically inappropriate and therefore detrimental to our general well-being, we also took into the doing of them the same uncoordinated use of the organism as we employed in all our other repetitive daily acts. Real change, real psychophysical improvement can come only through working to the means principle, which entails working against a habit of life. End gaining is it roots predominantly the thinking processes. We think in a way towards an end, so we don't exercise our thinking. End gaining in thinking is closing on the intellectuality. We already decide what end we're supposed to come to, and therefore we have no direction on the thinking. What you say? An end should be in direction? No, the direction comes from when you have body and mind together, not sitting like this. The end that intellectual life is talking about or thinking about is no end at all. It's an illusion coming from the cosmological fallacy. It's an obstruction and is the nutrient for causing us to develop T2 muscles and N2 muscles. This is why all students today, I don't imagine there'll be any exceptions, are slumped together predominantly dominated by T2 muscles in terrible conditions, sitting in a way that is destructive and suffering from different types of mind-wandering capabilities. Not even the voices can be enforced and not balanced on their end bottoms so as to have a feel for the sitting bones, not sensing their own bodies anymore, And when you don't sense your body, you don't sense your thinking. And then you will be ruled by unconscious inclinations. You will be exactly that instinctual being that Benjamin Libet depicted. And you will have no conscious mind at all. It will be the reflective consciousness. The hen or the egg, that's the question. Well, I think there is an actual hen here. It starts with a cosmological fallacy, which is not a fallacy in the regular sense of a fallacy. It is in many ways incredibly different. And I would also say unavoidable. No one in the 18th century could raise his hand and say, there's a problem here. No, it needed to do its thing, needed to spend 200 years and go into the 20th century and experience first relativity and then quantum mechanics. So it's not a fault in the normal sense. But there, of course, lies in the trouble of explaining it. We usually think of faults in an end-gaining way, that fix it and everything will be okay. No, this is lying in every part of your system, every part of your joints. It's a muscular thing as well. So there can, of course, be no instant realization, thank God. And just read the book and, oh, I realized. No, there's no chance of that. This is real. Reality takes time. If it doesn't take time, it's not real. And the no time of the Newtonian paradigm is endgaming. I want reality now. There is no future, there is no past. Now. Or past and future are derivable from the now, which is actually what Einstein say. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. And with this snowy landscape, bye-bye for now.